The Candid Frame is supported by donations by listeners just like you. Help us to bring you great conversations with great photographers. Support the show today with your monthly contribution through our Patreon effort at patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or click on the link in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. Thank you.
This is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame. One of the reasons why I believe that photography has had such an allure for me is that it provided me access to so many different worlds, different people. For me, growing up in South Los Angeles, my world was pretty small. But through magazines and books, I could see and experience things that I hadn't even imagined. And as I got older, the camera provided me the means by which I could explore and photograph these worlds and people myself. It's what's led me to respect and admire those in our world who choose journalism and photojournalism as a career. Jamie Rose chose a career as a photojournalist, which led her to document stories both in the United States and abroad, with images published in the New York Times, Newsweek, and Time magazines, and Rolling Stone. But it's been her humanitarian work that has come to define her as a photographer as well as an educator, as a co-founder of the Momenta Photography Workshops, a unique educational collaboration between photographers and nonprofit organizations in the host cities where the workshops are held. During a time when the validity of a free press and journalism is being questioned and challenged, it's important to be reminded of the kind of people who choose to use words and pictures to share the truth of the world with you and me. Well, Jamie, welcome to The Candid Frame. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I definitely want to talk to you a bit about the Momenta workshop, because I think it's an amazing concept, and the work you're doing is phenomenal. But I want to start off by talking about you and your work, because I can see from your resume that you were a photojournalist, and you still are to a great extent. Tell me how your interest in photography sort of geared you into being a photojournalist.
Well, my parents were photographers, so I've always been surrounded by the art form itself. My parents were both school teachers, and my father was a school teacher, and my mother was going to school and getting her master's and her bachelor's degree. And then when I was younger, they had a wedding and portrait studio, and they had another business partner who was a school psychologist. So back then, wedding season was only during the summer, and they would do family portraits and things like that. And there was a dark room in our basement. And being a child of photographers, you are constantly being photographed. So the art form has always been around me. When I got into high school was when I was approached. I took a photography class, and my teacher, Mike McClure, said, "Have you ever considered doing the newspaper?" And I said, "Yeah, I've always wanted to be a journalist." And he said, "Well, you should be a photographer in the school newspaper." And so for the next 4 years, one of my best friends and I were she was the editor of the paper, and I was one of the photographers, and we just had a great time covering events all over the place. We were pretty well awarded. And then I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I just wasn't quite certain whether I wanted to be a writer or whether I wanted to be a photographer. And so I went to American University in Washington, D.C. I joined the school newspaper there. I really enjoyed the coverage, but at the time I was writing just as much as I was photographing. And I got an internship in a way that most people don't actually get an internship. It was the summer after my junior year, and I walked into the Record Courier in Ravenna, Ohio. I was so green. I can't believe they let me do this. I walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Jamie. I would love to intern here, and I will write and I'll take pictures and I'll do whatever you guys would let me to do." And they said, "Well, we can't pay you." And I was so naive. I was like, "Oh, you can get paid for internships?" And I said, "That's okay. I'm making money as a waitress, hand over fist." And they said, "Well, we can give you like a small stipend, but we've already paid an intern. But why don't the two of you guys just work together?" And so it was great. Doing hometown coverage was really interesting. And so the year after I graduated, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had a English literature degree with a minor in photo communications. And I said, I went back, I went to the editor again, and I said, "I've graduated and I need to start making money. I would love to come and work for you guys." And I still can't believe this happened, because they said, "Okay, what would you like to do?" And I said, "I'd like to be an entertainment reporter and photographer." And they said, "Great, you can start freelancing and show us what you got." So I went over to the desk, and the editor of the arts section said, "Well, here's a stack of books, here's a stack of CDs, and here's a stack of concert tickets that we get, comped for us, and theater tickets and things like that. And you can take whatever you want and go cover it and send us back a story." So I think a week later, I went into the hidey hole, and a week later I came out and I had reviewed one book, 5 CDs.
Oh, wow.
I had already gone to a theater performance, and I came back and I was like, "Okay, here's my hours and here's everything I did." And they said, "Jamie, we only do 1 CD review a week. We're good for the rest of the month. I don't know what else to tell you to do." And so I started to enterprise stories and pitch them. And I always pitched a photo component because I really loved photography. I started a series on my own it was called One Tank Trips. And I pitched it to the editor, and I said, because there used to be a television news story that they used to do way back in the early 80s. And I said, "What if we did that in writing?" And we went to all these different places around northeastern Ohio. And I said, I'd love to do that. And they were like, "Sure, go down, grab a brick of film," because that was back in the dark ages when we used film, "and go to it." And so I started doing all these trips. And one day I got this telephone call from my editor, the editor of the newspaper, or the publisher. He said, "Could you go meet with the editor today?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm in so much trouble." And I went in and I sat down, and then he said, "Well, I just wanted to say, my mother called me the other day and asked me, 'Who's this Jamie Rose?' Because I really love these One Tank Trips that are going in the Sunday paper." I was so terrified. I said, "What? I'm not being fired?" "Oh, this is fantastic." And he was like, "Keep up the great work. I love that you're enterprising this stuff. And I can't wait to see what the next One Tank Trip is going to be."
That's great. I mean, you ensured your job by making sure that the editor's mother was happy.
Yeah, the publisher's mother.
Even better.
And so that really solidified, I love this. I love hometown coverage, and I love newspaper coverage. And so I still kind of thought I wanted to be Annie Leibovitz, and I wanted to go and be a big celebrity arts and entertainment photographer. But I say often that I was raised by a bra-burning hippie of a mother who was a stark raving feminist, and I love her to pieces because she told me from a very young age that just because you're a woman, you can do whatever you want to do, and you could be whatever you want to be, but the one thing you need to be is just. And so I always had a very powerful social activism growing up. And, we were encouraged to volunteer. And I went down and rebuilt houses after Hurricane Andrew in Florida. And I volunteered my time, not only for scholastic activities, but for charitable organizations. So it was always really a passion point of mine. And it wasn't until I met Mark Dolan and David Sutherland when I was during that year that I was working for the paper, I knew that I either needed to go to grad school or I needed to go to a bigger paper to kind of explore my photography. And I decided to look into grad schools. And I actually went to Syracuse, and I was originally looking at their visual and performing arts to get an MFA. Mm-hmm. And I talked with a recruitment counselor there. They were like, I don't think you need to be here. I think you need to go over to Newhouse. I think what you want to do is more in the editorial side of things. And so I went over and I met Mark Dolan, and I met David Sutherland, and I got some information, and I applied. And I met with David Sutherland, who ended up being one of my mentors, who was my interview to come in. And he said, well, you have mediocre test scores from my GRE. And he said, you have a pretty average portfolio. The thing I'm most fascinated about is you have a job right now at a newspaper, right? And I said, yes. And he said, and you're going to quit your job and you're going to come to school. I said, yes. He said, we're not going to guarantee that you're going to get a job. And I said, okay. And he said, this is a very financially unsound decision you're making. And I said, I know. And he said, you're not the best candidate that we have. And you're going to have to work really hard. And I said, I know, I understand that. A couple of years later, I was, a year later, I was Mark Dolan's intern or teaching assistant. And he told me, he said, do you know why you got in? And I said, no, I have no idea, because out of all the applicants, they only chose 7 people to come in that year. And the other 6 people were vastly more qualified and better photographers than I was. And I hand bound my portfolio, and I created my own typeface and my own graphic standard to present my portfolio, as bad as it was. And Mark took a look at the application, and he told the rest of the group that were meeting to pick the candidates. And he said, she's not that good, but she really wants to be here. And if she's willing to put this much energy into her portfolio, imagine what she's going to do at school. And I've told people many times in my career, I'm definitely not the best photographer in the room, but I work harder than everybody else to just ensure that I get a place at the table. And I think that's really how my photojournalism career started. And Mark said, I know that you put that you wanted to be a celebrity photographer or something. And he said, but the second I met you, I knew you were one of us.
That's beautiful to hear.
Yeah. So that's how I got in. And Mark and David really inspired me to take that passion that I had for storytelling, but also for social justice, and combine the two of them together to make the work that I wanted to make that was going to change the world.
But when you were younger, even before you joined the school paper, you said you had an interest in photojournalism. What was that about? What was the appeal to you that you thought that you could express and explore by being a journalist?
I think I probably have an overinflated sense of right and wrong.
Okay.
To the detriment sometimes to my ability to talk politics, because I firmly believe that there are certain things that are right in this world and certain things that are wrong. In a previous episode, I really loved on this podcast when Maggie Stieber said that she thought that objectivity was something that you can't be as a photojournalist in many ways, and it can hinder you. And I agree with that, because I always found, I wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein, and I wanted, I saw the movie The Paper. I don't know if you ever saw that.
Yeah, great movie.
I love that movie, and I wanted to be like Glenn Close and Michael Keaton. And it wasn't until years later that I watched it again as a photojournalist, and I just totally the whole photojournalism scene when she falls and she doesn't know if she got the picture until she runs the film, broke my heart and made me happy at the same time, because I was like, oh, I've been there. I think that the power of the Fourth Estate is intoxicating. Because if you believe in justice and if you believe in the truth and the quest for truth, then there are only so many jobs in the world that allow you the luxury of being able to express that truth and get other people involved. There's politics, there's the justice system, there's philanthropy and nonprofits, and then there's the media and the ability to expose wrongs and and lead people to the truth, I think is one of the noblest practices that we can do in this world. And I'm incredibly honored to be a part of it.
Well, as you just said, objectivity is far more subjective than most people think it is. And, with you having just such strong feelings and opinions about right and wrong, being aware of that, your own bias in that respect, I think is kind of important for you to actually be fair. Tell me about the process of being able to sort of temper yourself with respect to that when it came to telling a story where you were sort of leaning to having a very strong opinion either in one way or another.
After I left Syracuse, I went and I did my thesis in Israel. And I knew that I wanted to focus on volunteer healthcare providers. I didn't have a lot of foreign experience at the time. And so I picked a country that I kind of thought I wanted to go into war photography. And so I wanted to cover people who were on the front lines, who were doing something to help the war, not just war itself. And so I researched a project and I cobbled all my money together and I went to cover a group called Physicians for Human Rights. And they were working with the UPMRC, which is the United Palestinian Medical Relief Committees. And they were like the Palestinian medical relief groups. And then Physicians for Human Rights were a group of Israeli doctors that were partnering together to help get medical care to the West Bank, to really rural villages, and then to areas that were affected during the second Intifada. So it was a pretty violent time. It was the first time I got shot at. The last time I wanted to do it, I realized I am not Andrea Bruce. I'm not Carolyn Cole. I am not James Noctway. I don't know how to photograph when I'm that scared. But put me in a hospital where there's, people who are just striving every day to help solve the problem. And I think, that just triggered something in me. And there couldn't have been a better learning experience for me than being in the West Bank, because I had an apartment in Tel Aviv, which is an incredibly liberal city. There's bars and clubs, and it's just this like wonderful pulsating amalgamation of different cultures and religions, and it's very liberal. And then I would get an ambulance with a bunch of doctors, and I would cross the border, and I would go into the West Bank, into sometimes like very conservative, very religious communities, suffering underneath the war that was going on. Because we can call it an intifada, but it really was an active war zone where militant groups were fighting with soldiers, and soldiers were, having to impose curfews on the population. And it couldn't have been a more frustrating situation to be in, because I had really dear, wonderful friends in the West Bank, and I had really dear, wonderful friends in Tel Aviv. And, I would sit down every time I would go to visit the clinics that I was working in, and I'd come back, I'd go to the West Bank from Tel Aviv. They would say, like, what are they saying in Israel? What do they think about us? What's the what are you hearing? And then I would go back to Tel Aviv, and all of my Israeli friends and colleagues would say, like, what's it like over there? And why do they hate us so much? And people on the other side would say, why do they hate us so much? And it's so hard to be objective in that environment, because you're surrounded by all these people who have opinions, and they're very strong on both sides, and trying to explain the truth of the matter in a conflict that's been raging for centuries is really difficult. And it taught me about objectivity, and it taught me about how to form my own opinions about my work, and how to try to tell truth to both sides so that they can realize that, the one truth that I told everyone over and over again was, I've sat down with mothers of children in the West Bank, and I've sat down with mothers of children and parents, on both sides, and all they want are their children to grow up to be happy and healthy and not afraid. And they would be willing to do anything for that. And unfortunately, sometimes the only people giving them options were violent ones. And until you can find the peaceful solution for those parents, the conflict will never end, and it needs understanding. And that's what journalism can provide.
How did beginning to realize that the world and people and situations aren't as black and white as you may have thought when you were younger, that they're actually like these, sort of muddy gradations of gray. How did that start reshaping how you saw and told stories?
God, I love this podcast because you ask such amazing questions. I can't take credit for that. I think it's who you surround yourself with. I met my husband in graduate school. We were both studying photojournalism together, and we took a class with Professor Kinsey, and it was communications theory, and it was this very cerebral class, and we would have these incredibly intellectual arguments. And to this day, my husband and I do not agree on everything. We just had a very heated political discussion last night, actually. We used to fight constantly across the table from each other. And we would have these debates to the point where Professor Kinsey would say, I don't even have to teach today because Jamie and Chris are just going to go at it. And we'd be discussing both sides of the argument. And, I'm perfectly willing to admit that Chris has changed. At the time, he changed my opinion on many things. I used to be pro-death penalty. I was very, very in favor of the death penalty. I thought this is a way to deter people until Chris, laid out all of this information. Here, the death penalty doesn't prevent crime. It's not a deterrent. When you talk to murderers, this is what they say. And this is where the legal system can corrupt the actual path of justice when it comes to certain crimes. And this is what you need to understand and examine it from this side of things. And we would have these raging debates. And then I would realize okay, you know what? There are two sides of this. And I have been surrounding myself in an echo chamber about this particular issue. And there are certain things I obviously am not going to waffle on, equal rights and civil rights and religious rights and freedom of the press and all that. I'm probably not going to waffle on that. But certain issues, I think it depends on who you surround yourself with. And if you allow yourself to be flexible in your opinion, then I think that can really help you understand that there is gray. And that's what journalism is about in a lot of ways, is examining, is there hope? Is there need? Is there, when we talk about nonprofit photography, hope versus need, when you're talking about journalism, what is the other side of it? And we can't only speak to one side of the story. We have to describe it. Even if the other side is abhorrent, there still needs to be an examination of it, because ignorance is what leads to away from the path of justice, I think.
Tell me about your time working in DC, because it's a rare experience for journalists, be they writers or photographers, to have the opportunity to work in that crazy town. Tell us about what that was like and what you learned about that experience.
Well, I graduated from school and I wanted to be a nonprofit social documentary photographer, but I had no idea what that meant or what that was. And I knew I was really interested in politics. I had gone to school at American University for undergrad, and then I went to Syracuse for grad school, like I said. And then when I graduated, I finished my thesis. I defended it. I got my degree, and then I didn't really know what to do. And one of my best friends from growing up, Liz Sidoti, had just gotten a job as a reporter for the AP in the Washington Bureau. And she was moving down to DC, and she said, why don't we move in together? And this would be fun. And, you haven't decided where you're going to, kind of settle in and do some work. And I had been freelancing in Ohio for a little bit. I'd gone back to see my parents for a couple of months, and I'd been freelancing and working for USA Today quite a bit. And I said, why not? I love DC. That sounds great. Let's move in together. And then we spent a week looking for apartments together, realized we couldn't live together. And she found an apartment, and then I found an apartment right across the street from her. And we were steps away from the Capitol. It was fantastic. And I said, okay, I'm going to be a Washington, D.C. political photographer. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm going to make this work. And so I took my portfolio to absolutely everyone that would entertain an interview with me. And I never asked for a job, and I never asked for a contract. And I just would say, I'm new in town, and I would like you to see my portfolio and tell me what you think. I learned a lot from that experience, actually, because I learned that there were certain organizations that I didn't want to work with. Like, I sat down across the table from an editor and he looked through my portfolio and he was like, crop this, crop that, crop this, crop that. I would just not even have this in here. And we got to the end and he said, well, thank you very much for coming in. And that was the first time in my career that I thought, I don't want to work for you. I don't care if you are going to pay me and I'm eating ramen or whatever. Like you and I wouldn't make each other happy in an editorial relationship. And that was a huge eye-opening experience. And I started to get different kinds of work. And a photojournalist in Columbus actually said to me one time, if you're going to freelance, don't say no to anything for a year. Just take every assignment you possibly can, every single one that you're available for. And I said, okay. So I shot weddings. I shot real estate headshots. I shot some political stuff, and I worked on getting my credentials. And I would say my big break came because I was doing, a little bit of hill work, and I was getting some freelance stuff. And then I went to the NPPA Northern Short Course in New Jersey. A friend of mine from grad school, Seth Sadisky, was the volunteer in charge of portfolio reviews. And I was sitting outside very diligently waiting for an appointment because I had, my 30-minute appointment. I was ready to go show my portfolio to somebody that totally didn't hire me. I can't remember who it was, but it was like somebody who was not interested in me at all. And he's like, Jamie, listen, just come here. I know you did some work for the New York Times, and I know that you were really interested in, maybe working more for them. And Kevin Larkin had an appointment, but that guy never showed up. So do you want to take his place? And I was like, what? Yeah, sure. Why not? And he was like, I know they changed their contract and everybody's like really anti it, but you should go and just sit down and talk with him. And so I sat down with Kevin and he picked up my portfolio and he laid it out on the table because I love print portfolios. I always carried a print portfolio because we're photographers. We like to touch pictures. We like to see them and touch them. And a laptop is so, separating. So he laid it out on the table and he said, why aren't you working for us? And I said, well, your contract got a little dicey. And he was like, okay. And he sat me down. He was like, let's go line by line. And he went line by line on the contract with me. And he talked about all the new clauses that were in it. And he said, I'm going to call you on Monday. And I really want you to think about it because I really want you to start working for us in our bureau down there. And I said, okay. And I thought about it over the weekend and I looked at the contract and I said, I know people out there are going to call me a scab because they did, because they had made their contract not as favorable as some people thought, but it actually ended up being really great for me. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And the next thing I knew, he said, okay, you need to go meet Stephen Crowley and Doug Mills, and they're going to show you the ropes and we're going to get you in the rotation. Next thing I knew, I was working for the New York Times on contract for sometimes 5 days a week. Sometimes they would just book me out a whole month. And I had two of the greatest mentors that any political photographer could ever have with Doug and Stephen. They taught me more than I possibly could have imagined when it came to how to be a professional and how to be well respected on the Hill and how to be creative in an environment that is so anti-creative sometimes. Yeah. I mean, you're photographing the same people in the same lighting, in the same room, day after day. And, people jokingly say the only thing that changes are the ties. So it's challenging to go in and say, not only do I have to be creative today, but I have to be more creative than the wires. Because, if you're not, and they constantly, and which is difficult because the wire guys are Wynn McNamee and Chip Samadavia and Alex Wong, and, some of the most incredible photographers of our age. And you're shoulder to shoulder with them, crammed into a tiny little well, trying to be more creative than the next guy. So it's challenging and it's exciting. And as a citizen, it's probably one of the greatest honors to be able to do that particular job and to be able to be at the feet, literally crouching on the ground at the feet of power and watch how our democracy works.
So tell me about that, because we're seeing a lot of that right now with all the different committees and hearings that are being held right now as we transition from one administration into another. And, when you see the wide shot, you see the photographers there on the ground, right in front of the table, photographing these people while they do their testimony or whatever. And it's like, wow, there's not a lot of flexibility there in terms of the photographer. So, as you said, you're trying to do something that's kind of unique and different from, the man or woman who's crouched there next to you. So how do you find ways of being creative when you're, basically right there, sitting there, right next to your competition, and you have so many limitations imposed on you? How do you make the photograph your own?
Well, I think there's 3 responses to that. One is really knowing your equipment and your gear and having a very comfortable, accessible setup. And I know that sounds like kind of simple, but when you can't move and you're squatting or you're sitting Indian style, like right in front of a table, and you can't go anywhere and you can't crawl in front of a whole bunch of people and be like, I need a different angle. You need to make certain that you have, your gear like the back of your hand. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to know the story. I would wake up every morning at 6 a.m. and I would turn on NPR. And I would listen to NPR all morning long as I got ready, because whatever was on NPR was what I was going to be covering that day, guaranteed. And so if they were talking about Senate hearings, I didn't need to know that I had to show up and that, the attorney general was going to be testifying. I need to know why he was testifying, who else was going to be testifying, what they looked like, who would be coming with them, their wife or, something, or their husband. And you would want to know, are they part of the story? Is that the moment I'm looking for? Because sure, you get the things in the bag that you need to get in the bag. Like, here, I'm holding up my hand and I'm testifying and I'm shaking hands with the senators as I walk in the door or whatever. But then it's part of the larger story. And I think that takes a lot of study and a lot of professionalism, and it takes a lot of attention to detail that can be lost on novice photographers. Like, I can't even tell you how many moments I missed or how many people walked in a room and I didn't even notice them. And some of the, guys who had been on the Hill for years looked up and went, oh my God, that's, former Senator so-and-so, who was a senator when I was in junior high school. So I wouldn't, I didn't know that, and I should have. And it's a really high stakes environment, and it requires you to be on your game a lot, and it requires camaraderie. I would say that's the sort of the third thing in that, is that, there were so many times where here's a prime example. This is one of my favorite moments on Capitol Hill. I was standing at this cluster, and we were all waiting for these senators to come out because they had done this procedural thing where they had shut down all the doors and turned off all the cameras inside of this one hearing because they were making it private, and it was a big deal. And the Democrats were just trying to get a foot in because the Republicans had been in, they were in control of the Senate, and this was the only procedural thing that they could do. And all of a sudden I feel this tap on my shoulder, and I look next to me and it's David Burnett.
Oh yeah.
He's like, hi. I said, hi. I was this is maybe 2 years into my working on the Hill. And he said, do you know what's going on? And I said, yeah. And so I kind of explained it. And he said, so where are we allowed to stand? And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm talking to David Burnett. And I tell him okay, well, you can't go here, but you can go there. But whatever you do not stand right there, or the sergeant at arms is going to drag you away and pull your credentials, and it'll be bad. So just come over here, and this is where we're allowed to be. But you can kind of move around here. He's like, wow, thanks. I rarely come up here. I said, oh, that's fine. He said, oh, by the way, I'm Dave. I know who you are. I'm Jamie Rose. It's really nice to meet you. And he was like, thanks a lot for your help. And that was such an amazing moment for me, because I'm like, man, I know nothing. This is David Burnett.
This is David Burnett. Yes.
And yet I was able to help him out. And at the same time, I had people like Win McNamee and Doug Mills and Stephen Crowley and all these guys, helping me out to get me to that next level. And the camaraderie that's on Capitol Hill, and the sort of honor that happens, obviously you sometimes have to elbow your way to the front and do all of that. But at the same time, we all have a job to do and we can all be, good about it and help each other out. And I don't think that exists in a lot of other areas of journalism.
Yeah. Well, tell me about Momenta, the workshop that you've helped create. How did that come about and why?
Whenever Congress would go out of session, or it would be like an election year and slow goings on Capitol Hill, after a number of years on Capitol Hill, I started to want to go back overseas. And so, to make a long story short, I saved up for about 6 months. 8 months, something like that. I put as much money as I could in savings. I sold my car. I boxed up my apartment and I put it into a storage unit. And I went over to Africa. I had been researching a story. I have we call her our adopted sister, is from Kenya, and she's Kenyan. And I called her up and I said, Kagendo, I really want to go to Africa. I've never been. I think it would be, a really interesting thing. You're Kenyan. Tell me a story that no one knows about Kenya. And she said, my sister is a maternal health doctor, and she volunteers at Kenyatta National Hospital, which is it is the largest public hospital in Nairobi. And they have a big abandoned babies problem there. And I said, this is fascinating. What does that mean? And she said, well, women will think that, especially the women, because Nairobi is, if you talk to certain urban planners, the second largest, slum in Africa. And so right across the street from is the hospital. And so women would sometimes have babies and they would leave them at the hospital because they thought if they left them at the doctor's, they would have a better life. And I said, this is fascinating. And she said, all of these doctors come together and they do really great work with these babies, and they try to get them adopted or get them into orphanages. And so I think you should go and talk to her about this when you get there. So I said, okay. So I packed up all my stuff and I decided to get on a plane and just run over to Kenya and I got a one-way ticket and said, I'll just figure it out. And so I started doing a lot more personal documentary projects. And when I was there, I met the director of East Africa's Doctors Without Borders. And at the time, Uganda was in the middle of its civil war. And he said, do you want to come cover our clinics in Uganda? And I said, yeah, I would love to. He was like, yeah, we'll fly you wherever you want. Just tell us where you want to go. And we'd love it as long as we'll put you up and we'll feed you and we'll talk about, getting your work published by us. And how about that? I was like, yeah, absolutely. And so I said, send me where nobody would go. Send me where no other photographers are going. And he was like, well, there's this camp that's like out in the middle of nowhere. I said, okay, I want to go there. And I started to really dive into nonprofit documentary coverage. And I realized this is where I want to be. This is my home. And so I focused on doing a lot more nonprofit work. And I kept telling people, I'm really interested in nonprofit documentary work. And at the time, Chris Anderson, the other co-founder, who is John Christopher Anderson, the photo editor, he was at National Geographic. The other photographer that started it is Seth Butler, who's a documentary photographer based out of Vermont. And the two of them had met in New York, and they were consulting with Magnum photographers who were teaching their own workshops. And every time they would get done with a workshop, people would privately come up to them and say, whenever you guys are ready to teach your own workshops, I want to go with you. I learned more from you than, the big name guy. So they, in the summer of 2007, said, what if we were to do this? What if we were to start our own company? And they approached me and said, we're thinking about doing this and we want to do, documentary workshops. And I had been asked to teach a nonprofit workshop when I was in Uganda. So from my first experience going over to Africa, probably once a year after that, I would go over with different nonprofits to cover work in East Africa. And while I was there, I was approached by a workshop company to teach a nonprofit workshop. The experience was awful because the company the students were all supposed to find their own nonprofits, and half of them showed up and they didn't have nonprofits to work with. And so I was using every contact of mine in the book. And there was another another filmmaker who was there as the teaching assistant, and she was like great, and she used all of her contacts, and we had a local provider named Vanex who was using every contact that he had in the book, and he was like our fixer, and a journalist based in Kampala. And I just said, this is a mess. And so when they came to me and said, we want to start doing these workshops, and would you want to teach these nonprofit workshops? I was like, absolutely yes, but I want to do it completely differently from the way that everyone else is doing it. And they said, well, that's fantastic, because we want to create a workshop company that's different from the way that everyone's doing it. So let's do this together, and let's make it less about the personalities who are teaching the workshops and more about the documentary work that's coming out of the workshops. And let's teach people the skills that they need to be professionals, whether they're citizen journalists or whether they're, actual working journalists. Let's take instructors who are really good teachers, and let's put them in the field, and let's take journalists who don't have the opportunity because the newspapers are cutting so many budgets, and put them in India or put them in Uganda or South Africa or Sierra Leone. And let's get really good journalists out there covering stuff, and let's teach people who are passionate about documentary work to be better on all levels. And so Momenta Group was born. We had our very first workshop in 2008, and the first workshop was to Burma. It was about 2 months after the cyclone had just gone through, and journalists couldn't get into the country, but because we were leading a photo tour, technically, we went in, and there was beautiful coverage that came out of it. It was featured on AOL News, and one of the stories was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize from that first workshop.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was incredible. Barbara Salisbury's work on sugar babies, these children of molasses workers, was featured in the Washington Times, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer. And so it's really an incredible journey. We're coming up on our 10th year officially in 2008, and we've had over 500 students come through our programs. We've done more than 50 workshops around the world. We have worked with, I think it was something like 300 different local nonprofit organizations, and we've created a community that is something that is truly special, and probably the proudest of all of my legacies that, we've done.
Well, you created a really unique experience because you put photographers with a nonprofit in whatever city that you're teaching the workshop. So it's not them just listening to a bunch of presentations. It's about throwing them into the pool and saying, okay, here's your client, get to work.
Yeah.
Well, as you said, you have people who are citizen journalists, you have people who are seasoned photojournalists, and everything in between. What are some of the things that they have to come to learn, considering that they may not have much, if any, experience in the world of nonprofits and NGOs? Because it's completely different from, doing typical corporate work or editorial work.
In certain regards, I feel like nonprofit photography is like the perfect storytelling combination for like all of the crossroads of photography. Because the biggest hurdle, well, I'd say the citizen journalists have a big hurdle to jump through, and then the photojournalists have a big hurdle to jump through, because certain photojournalists will come in and say, well, because I'm shooting for a nonprofit, ethics be damned, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not journalism. And my answer to that is your ethics are your ethics. I don't care if you're photographing for a corporation or a nonprofit or a newspaper. You have your ethics and you keep them. And the truth telling is why nonprofits are going to photojournalists, trained documentarians, because they want to show the truth of what's happening. Now you have to, when you're shooting for a nonprofit, of course, you want to balance, like I said before, hope versus need. We have to show that there's need, of course, mm-hmm. but you can't go in and show the most hopeless situation that anyone's ever seen, because donors are going to look at that and say, well, obviously there's nothing that we can do to help this. And at the same time, you're not being honest about the reality that's in front of you, because there's always hope. You made a comment during one of the interviews about growing up in the Dominican Republic, and you and Anamia Davidson were talking about, like, finding joy and finding passion and happiness in situations that sometimes aren't. And I tell the students a lot, like, I've been in some of the worst places that human beings have created for each other, in some of the most hopeless situations that you can imagine. And I've always found somebody who is full of joy. So you're lying if you don't show the hope and the joy that's in the world. You just have to show the hope and the need, and you have to balance that together. And that's truthful storytelling. That's a balanced viewpoint. And so I think the biggest hurdle in the photojournalist side of it is just getting over that and realizing, like, it's the same work. You're doing the same thing. Right. You just have a different client. And for the citizen journalist, I think, in some regards, well, to be perfectly blunt, the thing that I find the most frustrating about teaching sometimes is the value judgments that certain people put on nonprofits. Like this concept that I can only photograph, like I hate the word grit, except when Angela Duckworth is using it when she's talking about grit. Read that book, it's amazing. But like when people say, I just want to photograph the grit. I need to photograph like the dark side of things. And I was like, you're doing such a disservice to the people that are working for these nonprofits that are trying to make the world a better place. Because all you're focusing on is the bad. And that bothers me, because I think that it's our job to show the balance. And one of my prime examples is there was a photographer who did this great documentary project with the LASPCA down in New Orleans. We work with the Louisiana SPCA. And the photographer is following around one of the animal control officers. And in one day, this officer went and had to take a pet away from someone who was abusing the animal. Of course, and there are photographs of the person like screaming at him and calling him horrible names and telling him that he's a terrible person. Then there was a feral dog that had obviously been in a really bad dog fight, who was injured, and it was terrible. And he had to like pick it up. It was a pit bull, and it was not too happy about, it was injured, of course. And then they had to take it to the hospital, and he was so badly injured, they had to put him to sleep. And there's just a stunning image. It's heartbreaking, of the animal control officer, hugging this dog as they're putting it to sleep so that he would feel joy. Then later on in the day, as they were driving home, and he's spending this whole day in the life with this guy, he said, I'm supposed, I have this list of like people that have puppies that, they have adopted, or dogs they've adopted. And this guy actually, I'm going to go check in on this guy who just got a puppy. He's like single college kid, whatever. And he's sitting on the front porch. The photograph is the animal control officer just sitting on the front porch at the end of his day on a porch swing. And this guy's got this new puppy that he just loves. And the animal control officer is just like doting on him and just cuddling with him. And it's beautiful. And the reality of that story is, like, people could look at that and be like, oh, I don't want to photograph puppies. Like, I don't want to do that. That's not gritty. This guy's day was full of peaks and valleys and joy and passion. And he said to the photographer, people think that animal control officers, that we hate animals or something because we're always taking them away. And he was like, but I love animals, and that's what gets me up in the morning to do this. The story isn't about the animals. The story is about this beautiful human being who has tragedy and joy, and all in one day, and 365 days out of the year, he has to, face that. That's storytelling that goes beyond sometimes, I think, anything that you might cover on Capitol Hill, for example.
And it's, this whole idea sort of pervades everything that we've been talking about, whether you're doing documentary work for nonprofits or you're working as a photojournalist, is that, the photographer has to remember that it's not about you. It's about the people and their experience and trying to tell their story, and not coming in with your own sort of agenda or perspective and having that overly color the narrative that you're telling. And I know it can be difficult, but in order to be, I think, fair and to be open to the story that reveals itself beyond your own expectations is really the make of a great photographer.
I think so too. I completely agree. I mean, it's all about telling stories. It just depends on which stories you want to tell. I think my biggest frustration with the industry of photography in general is how exclusive it has become in many parts of the profession. I mean, when I was shooting for nonprofits, I went from shooting like 90% news to 10% nonprofits because I just really wanted to, try to do both. And then I shot like 90% nonprofits and 10% news. I called news my like dirty little habit because, the rates were terrible and the hours were horrible, but I loved it. And I'm so passionate, but I just wanted to tell really good stories. And, when I switched over, I had people tell me like, you're a corporate shill. Because you shoot for nonprofits. Somebody said, well, you're just pretty much just shilling for the nonprofits. That's not really journalism. I was president of Women Photojournalists of Washington at the time, and I was, predominantly shooting for nonprofits and doing documentary work. And, somebody said that to me, and I said, well, I guess I shouldn't be president of this organization then, because my storytelling doesn't go into a newspaper. But in fact, my storytelling was going into whole annual reports, big, long stories. And it's all about the stories. It's the stories that we tell and the audience that listens to them. As long as you keep your ethics intact and you focus on telling truth, then I think that's the heart of what we do. And this exclusionary policy of trying to put people in boxes is unfortunate. Yeah. And so that's why I'm so proud of the work that Momenta has done over the last 9 years, and from documentary travel photography and really telling people this isn't about just making pictures in a pretty place. It's about telling a story about the humans and about the culture and about the religion and about the traditions that make this place what it is. Let's tell that story and let's find a narrative. And at the same time, I would be very remiss if I didn't say that, a huge part of what we do at Momenta, almost every workshop is bookended and then peppered throughout with business skills training, because I think that's part of what sets us apart is we believe that you can learn how to be a really good photographer, and there are amazing master classes out there and there are amazing other workshop companies. But what we want to do is make sure that when you're learning this, you're learning how to be a good professional as well. Yeah. So we talk about crowdfunding, we talk about marketing, we talk about good financial practices and contracts and copyright and how to negotiate with clients to not get bowled over all the time. And so that's, the social aspect is the heart and the soul of what we do, and the business aspect is the brain. We really want to make certain that everybody gets both on our workshops, because we want to keep journalists and passionate citizen journalists working and telling these stories. And you can't do that without good business skills.
Yeah. And you guys are doing great work.
Thank you so much.
Well, my last question, which I ask each guest, is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Oh, this is such a hard question. I know. I knew it was coming too. Well, I'm incredibly excited to find out that Dotan is going to be on your show, because he's definitely a photographer that I would watch. Probably one of the most unique, passionate storytellers that I know that's up and coming right now. Can I just name 10?
10's a bit much.
Oh, okay. I think Sophia Nali Allison is one of the most unique storytellers that I've come across from the Momenta workshop side of things. She's a young, passionate photographer, and she is a very skilled documentary photographer and filmmaker. And she's doing some really beautiful work. And I love her South Central interviews that she did, audio interviews and portraits of different people in South Central, and the series that she did on her mother. The video she did on her mother is just beautiful. And she's just a very unique soul and a very unique voice that I think is going to set the world on its ear.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for making time for us today. I really enjoyed having a chance to meet with you and talk with you. Thank you.
This is delightful. And thank you for the service that you do with this podcast. It is a source of inspiration for many people around the world. And I really appreciate that you put your time and energy into doing this.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Jamie for joining us at The Candid Frame. You can check out her work at jamierose.net, and to find out more about the Momenta Workshops, visit momentaworkshops.com or click on the link in the show notes. Thanks for your continued support of The Candid Frame. If you haven't already, please take the time today to write a review in the iTunes store. Your ratings and comments help people to discover the great conversations like the ones you heard today. Thanks to Zach Kalman and Dan Scape for their 5-star reviews. You can also support the show by making a regular monthly contribution through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or you'll find a link in the show notes and the Candid Frame website. Or if you just want to make a one-time contribution to the show, you can do so via PayPal by clicking on the donation button on the Candid Frame website or in the show notes. To access our complete archive of interviews, download the free Candid Frame app, available for Apple iOS, Android, and Windows. Links for each can be found in the show notes and the website at thecandidframe.com. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @IbadianX. Remember to help spread the word. And this is Ibadian X, and this is The Candid Frame.